So today we're going to be looking at right livelihood. Traditionally these are 5, but we'll see that there are a couple others that the Buddha really didn't want to talk about, but that are also interesting. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. And if you're interested in helping to promote a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled world, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll have talks like these roughly once a week on Mondays, talking about early Buddhism, secularism, and sort of related philosophical ideas. So to begin with, right livelihood, in a broader sense, actually involves something more than just what kind of business we're involved in. It involves the idea of balancing our income and our expenditures, living in a way that doesn't get us involved in trouble. If we're expending too much, we're liable to get into trouble, get into debt, have other kinds of psychological issues coming up. And on the other hand, if we're not spending enough, that's a kind of miserliness that also the Buddha didn't like. So the Buddha was really, had a very interesting kind of view about how we should live our lives when it comes to economics. That we shouldn't be spending too much, but we also shouldn't be spending too little. We can say in general that right livelihood is honest dealing with people. It's dealing that is legal, that is ethical, that is peaceful. And in particular, the Buddha says that there are 5 different kinds of businesses that lay people should avoid. They should avoid trading in weapons, for obvious reasons. Weapons are used to kill, particularly to kill people. They should avoid trading in human beings. That is to say, they should avoid slavery and prostitution. They should avoid trading in meat, because that involves the killing of animals. They should avoid trading in intoxicants and poison. Poison, again, obvious, kills people, kills beings. Intoxicants, this is part of the idea that the Buddha was very much a teetotaler, did not believe that alcohol or other intoxicants were good for our mental state in a general sense. I think that there's a question, and heard Bhikkhu Bodhi bring it up in discussion, that in many cultures nowadays, particularly in Europe, there's the notion of drinking a glass of wine with dinner, in a sense that you're not really to get intoxicated. The point is not to become drunk. Whereas he speculates, and it may be true, that in the Buddha's day, trading in intoxicants was more like being a drug pusher nowadays, where the point really was to become drunk, to become intoxicated in a way that made you much, much more prone to violate other ethical strictures. Now these are all lay businesses. The Buddha actually discussed wrong livelihood when it came to monastics as well. And this might seem like almost an oxymoron, because you would think that a monastic, their occupation is being a monastic. So, in what sense, he might as well just say everything except being a monastic is wrong livelihood for the monastic. But no, he gives a long list in the Brahmajala Sutta of different livelihoods that are wrong for the monastic. And it's interesting to consider why he would have done that. It must have been that monastics were involved in various kinds of enterprises, either to make money or just for power or personal prestige at the time. I would love to read the list because it's very, very interesting, but it's just very, very long also. What I can say is probably would be most useful, I think, within this context, just to talk about a few of the highlights of that list, because the list has, although it's very, very long and so not really worth reading, basically involves various kinds of what we would call magic, casting spells, or various kinds of palmistry, or telling the future, omens, demonology, various kinds of, you might call today, alternative medicine, or quackery. These were all listed as what he called debased arts. Interpreting dreams, fortune-telling, telling the future in various ways. All of these must have been ways that monastics at the time were either making money on the side or, again, currying personal prestige with lay people. And we may wonder, why were they debased arts? To one extent, of course, they would have been debased, just in the sense that any kind of currying favor by monastics that didn't involve approaching awakening was to an extent debased, of course. In other words, it wasn't really the final goal. But it may also have been that the Buddha considered some of these to be fraudulent enterprises, at least as practiced by some people. It's not clear. I mean, he doesn't go into it. There's no reason to believe that the Buddha didn't believe in some kind of magic. I mean, the Buddha did believe that as you got closer to awakening, you gained certain kinds of magical abilities, so he was not a skeptic in the modern contemporary sense. Nevertheless, there is a clear feeling from these early texts that the Buddha was skeptical of a lot of what was going on. That would be the end of it, because, I mean, you might think, because these are the ones that are classically given as wrong livelihood, as things to avoid. But there are a couple more that the Buddha discusses in one text and a couple of suttas, where he only actually comes out and discusses them when pressed. Historically, classically, the Buddha will often refuse to answer certain kinds of questions for whatever personal reasons, but the idea was that if he was asked 3 times, he would relent and answer a question even if he didn't really want to answer it. And in both of these cases, he was asked 3 times by particular people about these kinds of livelihoods. And he refused to answer once, he refused to answer a second time, but when pressed, he came out with an answer. And these are the military and acting. In both cases, what he said was that people involved in these kinds of livelihoods were prone to a bad rebirth, which in the Buddhist terms, early Buddhist terms, meant that they were wrong livelihood. The military is obvious. Being in the military promotes the notion that you're going to try to kill people. It promotes a mind of hatred and killing towards others, at least potentially. And the Buddha had a kind of a complex relationship with the military. It's clear that in the early Sangha, the Buddha was ordaining members of the military, and they were joining the Sangha from the military of the various kingships in the vicinity. And this annoyed kings because they were losing members of their military. If anybody didn't want to serve, presumably they could just go to the Buddha and say, make me a monk. And so the Buddha got talked to. The Buddha then decided to make a stricture that you were not to be ordained as a monk if you were in the military. Basically, it seems, so as to satisfy the kings in the area that their military was safe for their own use, and that they did not have to worry about losing it to monasticism. But I mean, it's interesting in particular that the Buddha does not include the military as one of the 5 classically restricted kinds of occupations. You might think that since trading in weaponry is prohibited, that therefore it almost follows that using the weaponry would be prohibited. And of course, in the military, you have to use that kind of weaponry. So it might be that the Buddha didn't include the military in that group of 5 for the same kind of reasons that he decided to acquiesce to the kinds of pressure that kings put upon him. That is to say, that although he did not think that it was a right action, or I should say, right livelihood to be in the military, that he didn't want to really promote that fact because it was a difficult thing for people to hear, particularly people in power. Now, the second one is the case of acting, being an actor. And this is a little bit more complex. The Buddha says that being an actor is basically wrong livelihood because it promotes certain kinds of unhealthy emotions. It promotes passion, it promotes ill will, hatred, anger, it promotes certain kinds of delusion when it comes to comedy, let's say. And in this, very interestingly, the Buddha was really on all fours with some of what the Western philosopher Plato had to say about fictional poems and plays and so on. In both cases, the argument is that these kinds of arts are not conducive of attaining wisdom. I won't go into Plato's arguments right now, but the Buddha's argument basically is that the actor on stage is trying to promote passion, is trying to promote perhaps lust, is trying to promote anger, is trying to promote certain kinds of delusion. And that, for the Buddha, is really not helpful. So I hope this discussion's been helpful to you when considering your own kind of livelihood and the livelihood of others and what you might consider in the future for yourself. Again, the whole idea is to try to live a wiser life, a life that is kinder to people, that creates less harm in the world, a life that is less stress-filled, both for you and for other people, and in that sense to make the world a better place. So if you're new to the channel, welcome. I'm really glad to have you here, and I hope you enjoyed. I hope you found this useful. And anyway, thank you so much for being here, and we'll catch you on the next one. Thanks a lot.